Thank you all for jumping on and joining this, the first session of our grazing management workshop series. It's going to be focused around the pasture budgeting and grazing management practices on farm. So my name's Ed McGee. I'll be hosting today from AgriWebb, and we've also got Jody Davis joining me from AgriWebb with the workshop series. And we also have Dave O'Brien behind the scenes who'll be answering any questions and facilitating some discussion in that Q&A and the chat option that we have within the webinar. We'll also be introducing shortly our guest Hilary for the session, who's going to share her invaluable insights and experience into this important topic that we'll be discussing today. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let me know if everyone's able to see that from their end. Should hopefully be through there. Perfect. So the agenda for today that we'll be running through. So we'll start with just some welcome introductions. We'll dive into just a little bit of an overview around the importance of grazing management and the why. Why should we be looking at this, and why is this important for beginning to capture on farm? And then we're going to be hearing from Hilary, the leading industry advisor, on best practices, and also just, I guess, a further understanding on why this is such an important topic for us to be aware of on farm at this point in time. And then finally, we'll finish off with some Q&A and some question times, because I'm sure, based on looking at the polls here, there's quite a few of you guys that have never really captured this information, and I'm sure are looking to kind of dive into how you're able to capture that and what benefits you'll be able to gain out of that. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions to be able to dive into towards the end of the session, and hopefully cover anything that's raised throughout. So as you're all aware, I'm sure grazing management is an integral part of any livestock operation, as it lays the foundation for your productivity and efficiency with what you're able to generate on farm. So, understanding your growth patterns of your pasture rates and overall feed availability on farm can certainly allow you to make greater informed decisions around your stocking rates and your grazing rotations. By understanding these best practices and the steps you can take to understanding and implementing pasture management, you're certainly able to ensure the feed availability is present for grazing year round. And certainly help conserve biodiversity, which ultimately allows you to maintain and improve that soil health on farm. So grazing management is affected by obviously certain factors with your land condition, pasture quality and quantity, and the frequency of your grazing and intensity of your grazing as well. And within AgriWebb, we allow you to capture certain feed on offer and pasture growth rates across each of your paddocks, which can provide an insight into those current kilograms of dry matter per hectare present for grazing, and can certainly inform you of which paddocks are suited for grazing at that point in time, and continue to plan your upcoming stock movements through those valuable insights. This is then complemented by the input of your DSE values for stock on farm. And by importing this important information, you're able to start to see your current stocking rates by paddock, and also your days remaining from a grazing perspective in those paddocks. So you can start to understand how that performance of those paddocks are operating throughout the year. Their grazing intensities, what your average DSE loads are looking like across those paddocks as well, just to get an inferred understanding of what your productivity is in that current time for those paddocks. So we're going to be expanding on a lot more of the grazing capabilities in AgriWebb in the following session next week that we'll be running. But I guess the main importance of this session is hearing from Hilary and getting a bit more of an understanding as a whole around that kind of grazing management practice and why it is so important. So I'm going to throw over to Jody just to introduce Hilary, and then we'll dive into her insights and what she has to say on the matter.
Yeah, thank you, Ed, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome our industry expert, Hilary Bunny, to the workshop. Hilary is from Aggregate Consulting based in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales. I asked Hilary to join us today to shed some light on the recurring conversations spoken about with their clients and why measuring your pastures to maximise production in a grazing enterprise is vital. So g'day and welcome, Hilary. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more information on what you have to share with us today. So I'll pass over to you if you're able to share your slides.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, what about this one? Cool, how's that looking?
Perfect.
Thank you. Thanks, Jody and Ed, for that introduction and for having me on today. A really great topic to be focusing on, because it is so important for grazing businesses to be really focused on grazing management. It's the number one, as I'll go through, it's the number one key profit driver as a grazier that you can focus on, and having your head around the basics and then understanding how to implement and then utilizing some tools is really going to help improve your business efficiency, which improves production and therefore improves profitability as well. So a really important topic, and thank you for having me on to share it. I have had a couple of coffees this morning, so hopefully I don't go too fast through it, but if you do have any questions, please flick them through, and someone will, if I miss them, feel free, Ed or Jody, to interrupt and we can address them if you think it's relevant at the time.
Perfect. I might just jump into that point. I did forget to just say the results of the poll that we just had, which might be quite handy for you, Hilary, just to understand, I guess, a bit of the people that we have on board today and what their, I guess, experience is in this topic. So for the how often are you capturing and recording your feed availability? We had 58% of you saying never. So I guess a lot more of the cohort are probably quite interested into seeing, why this is probably going to be quite important and something that they can potentially bring in to their own operation. Then we also had, of those of you that are inputting some of your feed availabilities on a monthly or weekly basis, are you doing that and inputting that in when you're moving your livestock into new paddocks? 67% of you said no, and only a third of you are actually inputting those records or capturing that information whilst you're doing your stock movements. And I think the last kind of most important one here is that of those percentage increases in stocking rates that you think you could gain through these implementing these grazing management practices, 50% of you said a 10%, and then it was an even split between 25% thinking you'd get around a 5% increase in your stocking rates, and another 25% said that you get 15 plus. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea around how the cohort today is kind of operating around this grazing management practices.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ed, and thanks everyone for participating in that. So certainly that's good. We're starting from a base where you can really improve on some of those benchmarks there. So yeah, hopefully we'll get to the end of this and you'll have a bit more of an idea of how you can use these tools and the one that AgriWebb are about to implement to help, really improve your business management. So just to start with, the crux of today's presentation is to demonstrate how using grazing management to improve, or how you can use grazing management to improve the efficiency of your business. And what I mean by efficiency is the ability to turn product into profit. And so you're in an efficient grazing business, you're efficiently turning grass into production, into then profit. So making the most of that, and we'll use the term utilization a lot throughout this presentation. So making the most of that is how you improve the efficiency of your grazing business. Grazing management or pasture budgeting, I'll use those two terms, I'll interchange them, but really they mean the same thing, should be implemented both strategically and tactically. So strategically, I mean setting up your systems or forming the plan for your business or system, so the livestock enterprises that you run. So when you calve, when your turn-off dates are, or calve or lamb, and then when your turn-off dates are, what are the key times for you to be doing pasture budgeting in your system. So really setting that up and understanding how your annual average pasture growth curve impacts your livestock system and how to target the best utilization. And remember, optimal utilization equals optimal efficiency. And we remember that efficiency or an efficient business is generally a profitable business. So we do a lot of benchmarking at Aggregate Consulting. We've got a client base who benchmarks at around 200 clients annually. If you drew a line from Brisbane down to sort of Adelaide, the majority of our clients sit in that southeastern corner. And over those 30 years or so that we have that data set, the number one occurring theme is stocking rate, is generally the difference between top 20% producers and the average. And so over those 30 years on a per hectare, per 100 mil basis, the difference is around 17%, and that's DSE per hectare. Those of you who don't know, one DSE is the equivalent of a 50 kilo wether. So on average, the top 20% stock 17% more than the average of the database. And when you think about our database, you've also got to keep in mind that we call it, it's really a non-biased data set because people choose to benchmark, and therefore they are actively inputting their information. So on that basis, we assume that those people who seek out benchmarking and want to improve their business are probably more on the more productive side of agriculture. So when we're talking about top 20% of producers in our database, you've got to sort of think more along the lines of top 10% of the industry as a whole. So when you guys did the poll, and I think it was 25% of you said 15% plus, and the rest were below that, it's probably actually a lot higher for the majority of the database to improve stocking rate through pasture budgeting. So you should, those of the average of the industry as the whole, if you implement pasture budgeting and grazing management, you should actually be increasing or have the ability to increase stocking rate of greater than 15% plus. And I assume of the industry as a whole, greater than 25% plus. So that's the improvement that can be made there in your business. And so starting to target higher efficiencies within your business. And along with that benchmarking, so improving that efficiency, when gross margins are exceeding sort of $70 a DSC with what we're seeing in our benchmarking at the moment, that improvement is really, really significant. So if you're looking at a 10 DSC farm and a top 20% producer would come in and run that at 11.7 or something, that's $119 per hectare increase or improvement in profitability there. So it's really significant. It's not a small number by any means, and it's really important, particularly at the moment, probably where land prices are starting to get to a point where that return on investment is tighter, and it's going to be much more prevalent in grazing businesses going forward. So that's understanding your strategic side of things, and I'll go into a bit more about that. But the other side of that is your tactical pasture budgeting, which assists managers to manage seasonal pasture surpluses and deficits. So you've set up your system strategically based on your average pasture growth curve, but we know that that is really variable between years, between seasons, between paddocks. So being able to make timely and informed decisions, again, really takes a business from being a good business into a great business. So tactical pasture budgeting really means taking on opportunity and also managing risk. So if you miss out on an autumn, then if you miss out on an autumn growth, what sort of supplementary feed are you looking at, and how do you manage that risk moving into winter, and then what are your likelihoods of getting a spring, and what is that going to cost you on the other side? Right. Okay, so we'll start with the strategic side of things. In a grazing business, the essence of grazing is to convert pasture growth into animal production and then finally into profit. So growing pasture is by far the cheapest way to feed livestock, but that does not mean it is without cost. And therefore, the more dry matter that is utilised, the more efficient your enterprise is, to a point. And trying to utilise every kilogram is obviously unrealistic, because a significant portion of pasture will also always be wasted by decay and trampling. You've always got to leave that buffer there. And then also extremely high utilisation rates will result in significant amount of supplementary feeding, and the whole process that will then become uneconomic. So there's overdoing it. And then on the other hand, there's underutilisation, which is also unprofitable, because most of the costs of growing pasture are fixed and need to be repaid regardless. So they're your overhead costs generally. And to bear these costs and then fail to utilise the pasture results in significant inefficiencies. So they're your fixed costs, so your rates, general pasture costs, wages, labour, those sorts of things that make up a large amount of your cost base are in that category. But the biggest cost particular at the moment is the opportunity cost, or the money left on the table. So we know in agriculture that a significant amount of profits are made in sort of 3 out of those 10 years. So making the most of those opportunities when they arise is really imperative. So understanding what is being left on the table is probably going to be the biggest benefit for you to understand, for you in understanding pasture budgeting or grazing management. So the question really is, how much of the available pasture should I let my livestock consume? And how much do I need to leave to ensure the pasture will remain healthy, vigorous, and productive for a long time? And research over the years has gone into this, and the key is to set your system up to consume around 50% of what you grow. So just to illustrate that point, this graph shows the pasture growth on the left axis, percentage maximum, and then percentage utilisation along the bottom there. To get the most out of your pastures, you need to utilise between 50 and 60%. So anything less limits either efficiency or impacts pasture growth, and anything more impacts pasture growth and subsequent longevity. So that's like the really sweet spot in terms of utilisation of your pasture. So getting the most out of them. Sitting on that 60% where that arrow is there, there's very few producers who can do that. So that's why I've said, if you aim for 50%, and then you can take that opportunity with the additional 10 or so percent on an annual basis, is a really, really good point to start. So even in our database, there would only be a handful of producers who would consistently sit at 60% utilisation of their pasture. Dairy producers would sit sort of between 60 and 70%, but their pasture growth curve would be moved slightly in that graph because their inputs are so much higher in terms of fertility, which is not out of the question at the moment for grazing businesses, but generally this is where we see people sit and where that top 20% sits in terms of utilisation. So setting up your strategic pasture budget. So you want to look at, and this is strategic and tactical concepts. The difference is strategic, you're setting it up on an annual basis, and tactically you're then using that strategy to then look at your pasture budget seasonally and make tactical decisions. So what you want to know is how much is grown in terms of your pasture growth rates, and then what is consumed. And then you want the difference between those two to be around that 50% target of utilisation. So understanding your pasture growth curve is really important. So when are your deficits likely to be, and when are your surpluses likely to be? In Southern Australia, your deficits are generally midwinter, and your surpluses are spring. The amounts will obviously vary between years, but the pattern is historically constant. So setting up your system to target production over spring is the best and most efficient way to get to that 50% utilisation. So this slide is just showing a pasture growth rate curve on you can't see the curve, but I'll show you one in a second. If you imagine it, you can see that there's a little bit of kick up in your autumn growth. It then declines into midwinter, which is July, and then kicks up again into spring for your spring flush. So, and that is typical of a Southern Australian pasture growth curve. And they're the sort of the main points that you will be looking for when you're setting up your strategy. So the big question out of how much is grown is really how can I best utilize that spring surplus will get you the closest to your utilization target. So we've looked at how much is grown. We then want to look at how much is consumed daily based off the demand from the livestock class that's grazing the pasture. So whether they're dry, pregnant, lactating, or even growing stock, so your lambs or steers, means that they will have varied intakes. We reflect consumption on a DSC rating of an animal. So 1 DSC, or dry sheep equivalent, is the equivalent of a 50 kilo wether at condition score 3 maintaining. So that's maintaining their weight at condition score 3. 1 DSC intake is around 0.8 of a kilo of dry matter per day. So if you look on the table on the right, all those calculations, if you times the DSC rating by 0.8, you'll generally get to your intake on an annual average basis. So you'll need to work out the consumption over a 12-month period, which is calculated through a stock flow. This is calculating your intake on a monthly basis based on the classes of livestock grazing. So this information is pretty readily available. There will be slight variations in maybe where you get the information from and what it might be telling you. So in terms of the DSC ratings, some people might rate them slightly higher or slightly lower, but whatever you use, just making sure you're consistent and making sure that you are taking into account. So if you use these DSC ratings, for example, and you do a pasture budget over a month or in a paddock over a certain period of time, and you come out and you think that it might be slightly different, then you might need to adjust your standard reference weights or something like that. So I believe in the AgriWebb portal, they'll give you DSC rating references. So other areas you can get them are your LTEM sessions, building better breeders through MLA. There's heaps of information out there on how you can access and better understand this information. So that is what is being consumed. You then need to run out a monthly stock flow. So this one that you'll see on your screen now is demonstrating the spring calving beef enterprise and a spring lambing wool enterprise on 850 hectares. So that is really just following from January to December, the changes in stock classes on a monthly basis. So we can see through the stock flow that in spring, hopefully you can see my mouse there. In spring, your consumption increases, and that is because you have stock classes that are late pregnancy or lactating in that period, and therefore their intake is going to increase. They then decrease over summer and winter to in your stock flow. So understanding where those increases and decreases are in terms of consumption, and really planning that out and putting that in front of you is going to help this process. So we can see on that table that 4,400 kilos of dry matter is consumed over that period. You can see so someone's just asked, does the monthly stock flow need to be done separate to AgriWebb? It's always good to understand, I'll just put that over there, hopefully you can't see it. It's always good just to plan out your monthly stock flow, I think, to really make sure that you know, or put it in a way that you can understand it, make sure it fits in with your pasture growth curve, if that's the most profitable system for you. I don't know, Ed, if you want to jump in, can you get a monthly stock flow on AgriWebb?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of with that question there around the monthly stock flows, in terms of, you'll always, I guess, have your, your live livestock numbers and also your DSC values based on those stock classes on the live system. In terms of that kind of planning out through the year, I feel like this would be a complementary tool that you'd probably develop yourself as well, just to have that, so you've got an understanding of what your numbers or fluctuating numbers will be like throughout the year from a stock numbers perspective. We can pull with the livestock reconciliation report a look at your overall, I guess, livestock fluctuations in numbers historically, which can also help to, I guess, infer what those numbers are going to look like. But in terms of, I guess, from an AgriWebb perspective, this would probably be a complementary tool, this stock flow. But there is also within AgriWebb the move to have our auto updating and auto aging, which will also allow you to input that in. So you can say, for your kilos of consumption down the bottom, if that's on a feed consumption percentage basis, or say on a live weight basis, you'll be able to get that auto aging of your DSCs, which will give you a greater, I guess, clarity around that kilogram of dry matter consumption daily, to match up to what you've got there in that stock flow. So that's probably, I'd say, yeah, more a complementary tool that you'd have as well, but there are certain tools that certainly help, I guess, calculate the information that you have in this stock flow within AgriWebb in that kind of real time or live perspective.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, and just remember that this is setting your strategy for your system too. So a lot of what you'll use in AgriWebb will be, when we get into this tactical section, you will probably be more useful. So this is just making sure that the system that you're running on farm is the most efficient and profitable for you. So it's an overview of your business, and it's just really useful to get your head around. So if consumption is 4,400 kilos and growth is, so yeah, you can see, well, when I brought up that pasture growth curve or table, was just over 9,000 kilos. Then utilization is around 48%. And what the graph illustrates that you can see now is what this looks like on a kilograms per hectare per day basis. So in terms of the dark line, that is consumption. So consumption on a kilogram per hectare per day basis. And then in growth is the green line. So growth on a kilograms per hectare per day basis. So you can see the dark line, which peaks in spring, follows that pasture growth curve, which also peaks in spring. So spring consumption here on the dark line is slightly understated because we've used annual average figures, but in reality, your intakes range from 0.4 up to 0.6 of a kilo per DC per day, but you can see there's heaps of a buffer there. So you're not ever going to consume everything that you grow in spring, but that is something that your AgriWebb tool will be able to determine when you're looking at your tactical pasture budgeting. So remember the gap between your consumption and pasture growth needs, so this gap between the light line and the dark line also needs to take into account losses like wastage and decay. So you'll never you'll never be sitting exactly along that line. But the point is that your curve, maybe I should have put them on another axis, but is peaking at the same time your peak pasture growth is, which is generally spring, or always spring in Southern Australia. So what if your utilisation is currently really low? So if that was 48%, which is not really low, but maybe there's room for improvement there. So how do you go about that? You could increase your year-round utilisation, so increasing your stocking rate. To do this, you would need to focus on your midwinter stocking rate, which is your bottleneck, and maximising what you can squeeze through that bottleneck. So if that's where your deficit is going to be, then how much can you squeeze a bit more through there? Can you tighten that line between your midwinter, this line here, so midwinter here? Can you squeeze that line between up and carry more stock through that period? And how are you going to do that? And this also begs the question on supplementary feeding at the moment, particularly because it is, we saw through the drought that people fed all the way through the drought and still made a profit coming out the other side. So, if feed is cheap and it's economic for you to feed a deficit through that little bottleneck period, and you may come out better in the spring, better off in the spring, or more highly stocked in the spring, can you use that as a tool to increase that midwinter stocking rate and therefore lift your annual average stocking rate? This doesn't have to be done with grain. It can be done with nitrogen, so urea, just building that wedge so you can carry more stock through that bottleneck period. Increasing your spring utilisation, so lambing and calving in spring, if this is the most profitable system for you. Generally, it is in beef breeding enterprises and wool enterprises. Some lamb enterprises, you will likely be lambing a little bit earlier because it's more profitable for you to put on extra live weight on your progeny over that spring period rather than having your peak lactation at that time. But that's a whole different story. So putting on extra live weight on sow progeny, trading over that period, which we'll get into in this tactical side of things, and then fodder conservation will hopefully always be the last port of call, but it's better than doing nothing. And then, so once you've got a head around eating what you grow, it's about learning how to cost effectively grow more of what you eat. So if your stocking rate is where you think it needs to be, rightio, well, how do I lift that? And is that going to be increasing fertility, which is generally where you're going to get most bang for your buck? Or where's the next port of call for me to then further increase that stocking rate and increase that utilization and that efficiency in my business? So just onto the tactical side of your grazing management, which is really where a lot of your pasture budgeting tools will come into. Seasonal pasture budgets to quantify your surplus and deficits are really for seasonal management decisions. So we do these monthly for clients, but if not, or if you haven't done one, then the two seasons to really focus on are your spring season. So yes, it's always important to still pasture budget when you've got all this pasture, and then through autumn, winter. So understanding how you're going to get through that surplus or deficit over that period. So yeah, this is where having a really good pasture budgeting or understanding or a tool will be really useful, and obviously can be done as often as possible, but at the very least seasonally. So spring pasture budgeting, will there be the questions that you need to sort of answer through doing a spring pasture budget is, will there be adequate dry matter accumulated for livestock requirements until autumn? So if you've got all this feed now, but you're going to utilize it and then come out with 500 kilos in January or February, then you've got a problem in your hand because you'll have to be supplementary feeding until you get that autumn break. So making sure you're utilizing enough to be efficient now, but then also leaving enough on the table for you to get through to your autumn break. And then if that doesn't happen, you then need to look at what is that supplementary feed that you'll have to make up for to get through to spring. So how much pasture is already accumulated? How much pasture will the stock consume daily? How much pasture will be lost due to decay and trampling? What is the minimum dry matter available after pasture senesces? And how fast will the pastures grow until the end of growing season are all the types of questions that you need to look into. But hopefully my next slide will sort of put that into perspective for you a little bit. And these are obviously recorded, or take a screenshot of this because this is a little mini pasture budget. And this is what your AgriWebb tool will be doing in the background for you. So you don't have to do it on the back of an envelope all the time. But essentially, this is what a pasture budget looks like in terms of tactically assessing, is there a surplus or is there a deficit? What does that look like? And how do I use that information? So how much pasture is already accumulated? Kilograms of dry matter per hectare. So that's feed on offer. And this is a spring pasture budget. So I've started this coming into calving. So with looking at around September, I've assumed a September calving. And feed on offer is right down to the ground, which is different to pasture availability, depending if you're in New South Wales or, well, not really New South Wales and Victoria, but whether you've done an LTEM course or whether you've done a ProGraze course. So LTEM uses feed on offer. ProGraze generally uses pasture availability. But any way that you identify kilograms of dry matter, just making sure it's consistent. Pasture availability, you normally add on, so feed on offer, to get to pasture availability, you add on 300 kilos. But so I've used feed on offer, which is 1,500 kilos at the time of calving. I've assumed 620 cows and calves on 850 hectares. So how much pasture will the stock consume daily? That's 13.6 kilos. So I've assumed they're in late lactation for the majority of the period I'm looking at. So they're at 17 DSE. If you times that by 0.8, the intake is 13.6. Utilization is 60%. So even though your average over the year should be sort of 50%, it'll increase in spring and decrease in sort of summer, autumn period because the digestibility of the product or the matter that they're eating is higher, so they're able to intake more. So the required feed on offer, which is just your how much they're eating divided by the utilization of what they're eating, is 22.7 kilos of dry matter per day per head. So that's how much they need to meet that requirement. I've then said, radio, after this spring period, I want to come out with 2,000 kilos left on the ground, which will get me from January or end of January to my autumn break without having to supplementary feed. That period is 123 days between now and turn off. So the utilization per hectare per day is 16.5 kilos, which is your required feed on offer times by the number of stock on hand divided by the hectares of which they're grazing. What is consumed and wasted is just then the number of days that they are feeding times by that utilization number there. So over that period, they are consuming 2,034 kilos. Therefore, the required growth rate to have 1,500 kilos now, taking into account what they are eating and then having 2,000 left over, is 20.6 kilograms per hectare per day over that spring period. So what are you going to do with this information? I guess once you've worked it out, is really, this is what needs to happen for you to carry those 620 cows and calves. So we know over spring, your pasture growth rate was maximum of nearly 70 kilos. It probably averages around 35. You can just average from September through till the end of December. You're looking at around a 35 kilo expected pasture growth rate. So if your required growth rate is only 20, then there's a 10 kilo surplus in there that you have to play around with, which is great, right? So then tactically using that information to work out how many DSC you can then fill that surplus with. So pull me up if you need to, guys. Hopefully, I've still got one or two more slides. So this is then taking that information, and I've just put it into an autumn winter pasture budget. So you can see on the right-hand side here, if you were to do that same pasture budget over your autumn period and worked out that you had a surplus. So if your required growth rate was 15 kilos, but your expected growth rate is 20, then you have a surplus of 5 kilos. Your DSE intake is 0.8 of a kilo. Utilization has dropped off because you've got lower quality feed. So your required feed on offer is 2 kilos. Therefore, your surplus or deficit over a kilogram per hectare per day is 2.5 kilos. So you can stock that at an additional 2,000 plus DSE over that period to get to the same 2,000 kilos or whatever you worked out on your previous slide, to fill that, or you better utilize that feed. And then on the left there again, if it was a deficit, so if your required growth rate was 30 kilos, but you are only expecting 20 kilos of growth over that period, so your deficit is 10 kilos, then you have to look at how you're going to supplementary feed 4,000 DSE over that period. So again, it's about taking on opportunity on this side, but then also managing your risk over this side. So you've forethought through how much supplementary feed you need over that period, and then you can work out how much it's going to cost you and then start working through your management options from there. Rightio. So just give you a bit of a moment to process that. Again, these guys are, they will be recording this, so I really encourage you to revisit that. I might just skip that slide because we're running out of time, sorry guys. But in summary, your pasture budgeting will really improve the efficiency of your business. So we know that efficiency in terms improves production, which improves profitability. Strategic grazing management will set up your system, so making sure it fits your pasture growth curve. And then tactical grazing management will allow you to capture that opportunity. So if you're going to stock, if you had, a 10 kilo growth rate surplus, that's coming. So what are you going to do to capture that? Is it trading, fodder conservation, and then manage risk? So if you're going to have a deficit, that that's coming. So where is your supplementary feed plan and management plan to best mitigate that risk? So hopefully that gives you a pretty good snapshot of how to use your pasture budgets, and the tools that AgriWebb will give you will do all that information for you in the background. And then you can then start implementing that information on farm to to really improve the efficiency of your business. So yeah, thanks guys.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I certainly, for one, found that extremely informative. And I'm sure, as did everyone on the session, I'm sure there'd be a few questions that might pop up, down the track once you've had a look at this yourself and give it some more thought. I guess one question that I did have from my perspective was just around with the tactical side of things, how you are knowing what your, say, already accumulated feed on offer is at that point in time. I guess in terms of from a production standpoint, what's the best way, or I guess the cadence at which you should be trying to see what your current accumulated feed on offer is, and also the best way that, say, someone that's just trying to get into that would be able to, I guess, go out and capture that themselves, or try and get a relative idea of what their current accumulated feed on offer would be?
Yeah, good question. The best and easiest way that, aside from doing a pasture cut, which is heaps of information out there on how you can do that, but those MLA rulers that you can get pretty much of any consultant, they're really, really handy, particularly in spring, where the caveats of the ruler sort of match up the best. But it's really about looking at the height of the pasture. It takes into account the density of the pasture, and it'll give you a ballpark kilograms feed on offer. So one of those little MLA rulers, or the other thing is your boot. So the top elastic part of your boot, if you were standing in a pasture in sort of the beginning or middle of spring, and the pasture hits the top of your boot, you're looking at around 3,000 kilos of dry matter available. So that's another little rule of thumb. But yeah, those MLA rulers, and then understanding and trying out your pasture cuts is where you're going to be the most accurate. So there's heaps of information online on how to do that. The feed on offer library, it's an AWI tool that if you just Google feed on offer library, it will bring up heaps of different pasture cut pictures that you can calibrate your pasture cuts against. So you can find a certain season, certain pasture type, look at that picture, take it out to your paddock, wherever you're doing your pasture assessment, and sort of look and say, well, if this picture says there's 1,500 kilos there, I think it's about 20% less. So you can use them as well. That's a really good visual tool also.
Perfect, thank you. And I guess, unless there's any questions from the floor, I've just got another one as well, I guess, while people might be thinking. But at the start, when you were talking about, I guess, the efficient grazing management, and just around, how much available pasture you should remain in, say, a field, just so that you can ensure that it will remain healthy and vigorous. From I guess, more so down like a tactical path, but in terms of being, I guess, more so paddock specific as opposed to the property as a whole, is there, a rule of thumb or a recommendation you have around, at what point should stock be removed out of a specific paddock at that feed on offer value to ensure that you can get that substantial regrowth to then be able to go back in and graze that potentially, when you're in that kind of deficit phase?
Yeah, so it does depend, but if you understand your pasture growth rates and know sort of what your system is looking at like a minimum, so I might get a bit in trouble for this, but so our minimum is 500 kilos. And because our, what we think is, if you haven't utilized it and you know what your growth is going to be out the other side, you've done your pasture budget, then what's the point on leaving it there? It won't impact, most of Eastern Australia has just gone through a 3-year drought where they've had zero feed on offer, and look at all the wonderful pastures that you're seeing now. So saying that you'll leave 1,000 kilos there while it's still actively growing, to me, is still leaving money on the table. But you would only do that at when you know what your pasture growth rates are going to be. So absolute minimum, I would say 500 kilos. If you're going into a drought, or if you're in a drought, then using that 70% ground cover, or in summer is that 70% ground cover is another really good rule of thumb. But the concept and the idea is that utilizing as much as possible without, actively degrading the pasture base is really important. So that normally sits around that 500 kilos.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. That was that was handy for me. Yeah, I appreciate that. And then I guess, Joe, did you have any other questions? I'm just waiting to see if there's any in the Q&A section here.
No, I think you guys have really covered it off. I'm sure there's some burning questions, which I will assure everyone listening, we will cover off how to input all of this into AgriWebb in session 2. So keep Hilary's thoughts fresh, and next week we'll definitely show you how to input that into AgriWebb. I guess leading on from that, because we've got such a large portion of our audience that identify they haven't pasture budgeted before, I just wanted to capture your thoughts while I've got you, Hilary. AgriWebb, you can enter at any point, or on a mob movement, it's also prompted you. If these people listening in want to start getting into it, should you suggest that they do it by paddock as they're doing mob movements, or is it more of a full farm sort of analysis as the seasonal changes, if they're thinking, right, I'll get stuck into this moving forward next week?
So probably the way I would go about it, if I'd never done it before, is to set up that stock flow, Jody, and then look at your annual average pasture growth rates, and understand where your system has your surpluses and deficits, or where it peaks and troughs. Yeah. But if you don't feel that you're confident in doing that, definitely, using that tool to move, when you're moving stock, going out, looking at your pasture, assessing what's there, and then putting that into what's already in AgriWebb is going to give you sort of the basis or understanding of, okay, if I use this information, what's it going to spit back at me, and then how do I then use what it's telling me to improve my management. So starting anywhere is really important, but getting your head around sort of, so it's really two things: what's there and what needs to be, what's there and what's going to be eaten, and then what is the surplus or the deficit. So if you are doing that, moving them into that paddock, okay, there's 1,500 kilos here. I know over the next 30 days, they're going to consume 500 kilos. So I'll have and I want a minimum of 500 kilos out of those 30 days. Then I have 500 kilos to play with. So how much heavier can I stock this paddock at is really essentially what you're looking at. So yeah, definitely just starting somewhere. And if that is on a paddock by paddock basis, at least you're getting into the habit of doing that.
Yeah, great. No, it is all about building the habit. And I guess the great saying, you can't manage it if you don't measure it.
Amen.
No, well, in the essence of time, leading on, thank you so much, Hilary, for it's definitely been very helpful for myself as well. We are releasing tomorrow our new course, which is focused around this grazing management and pasture budgeting. So that will be launching tomorrow on the AgriWebb Academy. So for anyone AgriWebb users that haven't accessed the Academy before, I highly recommend checking it out. It contains video guides to introduce you to both the basics as well as some of the finer details across multiple topics. So if you do have any feedback or areas that you find not there, please let us know, because it's a work in progress for us. And you can also find the Academy from your web or mobile app, or by going to the website, and it's just by going to your menu, support, and finding the AgriWebb Academy.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'm just going to share my screen again there once more. If you have any additional information for Hilary in particular, for some of the things that were covered, or you wanted clarification on anything that was raised throughout that session. Just got a bit of her details up here to reach out there. And I'm sure, she'd be happy to give you a bit more of an insight into some of those things, and certainly help along the journey of trying to get into that, increase, pasture and grazing management practices on farm. So if there aren't any other questions that are popping up here at the moment, thank you all for joining. Appreciate it. I'm sure, hopefully you found it as informative as I did. I'm sure, thought that there was a lot of valuable information to take out of that. And certainly for the kind of cohort that we had here with a limited number of people with that full experience in capturing this information before, you certainly got a nice building block to start from here to go out and try and implement some of that in your own practices, and see if you can start to see some of those percentage increases in gains in that efficiency that you're able to, the grazing utilisation that you're able to gain on farm. The last thing I will touch on is just the second session, as Jody mentioned there. It'll be on grazing insights and analysis in AgriWebb, and it'll be next Monday at the same time. So if you've registered to this first session, you should be receiving that notification for that second session as well. And we'd love to see as many of you joining that as can. So